Now, ever since I stumbled across the story of the Voynich Manuscript, I was hooked. It is such a fascinating story. It really seems to be one of the last big unsolved mysteries that haunt us as humanity. We just can't make sense of it. Scholars and cryptographers have tried to solve it, get under the skin of it for centuries, literally all the way through World War I, World War II. Very bright brains have tried to make sense of the manuscript. They just can't understand it. But just recently, a few years ago, some English scholars actually have come forward and said that they now were able to translate parts of it, and they found out what that part was all about, and they want to extrapolate from that part, make sense of it. But we'll get to that at a later point in the video. What I want to start with is actually the manuscript itself, because the beauty of this story is anyone can look at it. It is freely available. I think it is the Educational Library of Yale University. They have a high-res scan of the full manuscript for anyone to look at, and this is just such a great resource, right? Because you can open the book, you can look at all the pages. I think it's 140 pages altogether, even though there is some indication that pages have gone missing. There are missing pages in the manuscript, but the available pages have been scanned and they are available for the public to look at, to examine, and not just in the resolution you see here. Like, it's absolutely gorgeous. You see this, you can zoom in, you get so much detail, you can see every single brushstroke of these illustrations. But here I am rambling on. Maybe I should explain what the Voynich Manuscript is first before we get into it, because some of you guys may not even know. So here's what we know. The Voynich Manuscript is a handwritten book that you can see here. It shows text around all kinds of illustrations, some of them showing people, some of them showing astrological or what seems to be astrological symbols. But most of them, and especially the first, 80, 90 pages of the manuscript, show these illustrations of plant life, of mostly fictitious plants. Now, there are some illustrations in here that seem to resemble real plants, but 98% of the sketches of these plants are fictitious. They don't represent real plants, or at least not real plants that we know of. And that's where a lot of the mythicism around this manuscript comes from, because a lot of people claim, it's either written by aliens, or it's almost a diary of someone who visited an alien planet and who tried to kind of almost cartograph or capture all these plants, all this wildlife that he was witnessing on this strange planet. And people are linking it to aliens, to UFOs, and to extraterrestrials. Now, the book has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, which puts it roughly in a window of 1404 to 1438. That is roughly the time when it was written, when it was put together. Now, some of the scholars have observed that some of the text, some of the symbols and the writing that, by the way, like I said earlier, can't be deciphered, right? The scripture that you see here that goes like a red thread through the whole book makes no sense, right? But we'll get to that in a second. Some scholars and cryptographers have claimed that parts of this scripture contain Macedonian and some other languages that we know of, but even knowing that, the translation doesn't make much sense, right? So they're able to pick out certain letters and say, yeah, that's a Macedonian word, or you can trace it back to that language, but further than that, none of it seems to make sense. Now, across the whole manuscript, and as I said, it's around 120, 140 pages that we still have, minus the ones that allegedly got lost, there are just a few words that are not written in this unknown script. One of them, for example, is a signature that is unfortunately now unreadable, and that is of a man called Jacobus Sinapius, and I'm trying to read it. I'm probably shredding the name awfully, but he used to be a pharmacist, and he went by the Latin name of Jacobus Sinapius. Now, this guy lived way later than when the book was written, so he didn't live in 1404, much later, but he was one of the owners of the book, and people assume that when he owned the book, he signed it. Maybe he was trying to give himself a little bit of a legacy, putting his name into the book itself. We don't know the exact circumstances, but scholars agree that even those pieces of the scripture that are readable and make sense have been added later. There are also some lines in the book written in Latin, but even again, those people try to translate them, they don't make sense. Okay, so even we can read the letters, putting them together as sentences just doesn't go anywhere. So as I said, people have tried to make sense of this seemingly undecipherable language. You can see here, this is from the Wikipedia article. We have tried to link the symbols to specific letters, but by no means is this a reliable way of reading it. Even we know this, and this is probably the best attempt that we're having, they can't decipher it and make sense of it. Also, the book contains over 170,000 characters, not different ones, right? This is just the overall number of characters. And what makes it even more difficult is that the scripture seems to vary. It is not consistent from the beginning to the end of the book. So it's been theorized that more than one person has written the script and that the encoded language differs from one author to the other. We don't know this. This is by no means confirmed, but there are theories out there that claim it's more than one author, and people have been potentially working on this book over generations. Now, when it comes to the ownership of the book and how it was handed down through generations from one person to the next, it was purchased a few times and sold. We kind of have a fairly compelling timeline of how that went down. So you see the 1400s here, early 15th century. So that was the time of the creation. Then we don't really know who owned the book and what happened to it. And then we know that a guy early or just before 1600, a guy called Karl Wiedemann, bought it, and then Rudolf II. You can see there are question marks behind it, so this is still in question. Then it was owned by someone who was unknown, and over the years it's been owned by many, many different people, including Wilfrid Voynich over here, okay? And that's the man who studied it extensively. That is him here, Mr. Voynich, among his books in Soho Square, okay? I think that must be in London. But it says here as well, he was never completely forthcoming about how he acquired the mysterious manuscript that now bears his name. Obviously, he was very fascinated by it, and then ultimately it was named after him. So calling it the Voynich Manuscript is not because of the author, and we know who originally created it. It all comes down to this man, Wilfrid Voynich. He studied it, he owned it, and he is the name giver for the actual manuscript. There's also, as you go through it, evidence of retouching. Some of the texts seem to have been amended over the years. So there are loads of question marks here of what is real, what isn't. Was it several people who worked on it versus was it just one person? We don't know. But the fact is that it all does not take away. If anything, it adds probably to the mythicism of this book and the fascination that emits from it. Now, let's talk about what I teased earlier. There seems to be a guy who has finally encrypted it and claims to have made sense of it. And this is all based on this one article. This is the only article I could find about this. So questionable, right? It's on artnet.com. The article was written in 2019, so it's been 5 years, and it's titled "A Scholar Has Cracked the Mystery of the Voynich Manuscript, the encrypted medieval artwork that defeated codebreakers for years. The 100-year-old code, which some people thought was the work of aliens, describe women struggling to bath unruly children at bath time." Again, I'll link this article down in the description. You can read the whole thing. I'm not going to do that now. However, there's still plenty of question marks around it, so I will have my own theories, what I think this book may have been or what's behind it, so we'll get to that in a second. But the guy who here claims he has finally decrypted it is a guy called David Cheshire, and he wrote a paper that was published in the journal Romance Studies, describing his findings. The research associate at the University of Bristol, in the west of England, described his disbelief and excitement when, in quotes, "I realized the magnitude of the achievement both in terms of its linguistic importance and the revelations about the origin and content of the manuscript." So he says, I finally cracked it. I finally understand what it's all about. And he says the key to cracking the code was identifying that the original text was written in an extinct language that is a predecessor of several modern-day European languages, including Spanish. It is the only known example of proto-Romance because the language was only colloquially used, whereas the text-based communication was undertaken in Latin. After making the connection, Cheshire was able to decipher the codex of the document in just 2 weeks. So many smart people have tried to crack it for centuries. He deciphered it in just 2 weeks. The British academic says that Dominican nuns compiled the manuscript as a source of reference for Maria Castile, Queen of Aragon. If you know more about that, listen, I'm not a history expert. Leave your thoughts on all that down in the comment section below if you can add to this. But he continues to say that one panel of the manuscript depicts 2 women wrangling 5 children in a bath. The drawing is labeled with a word describing different temperaments, like tozr means too noisy, and others meaning losing patience and silly, foolishness, cloudy, dull, sad, well-behaved, and so on. The words all have surviving traces in contemporary Romance languages. One of the children's harried guardians is described as "oh la la," which may be a precursor of the French phrase "oh la la." Another page, anyway, it goes on like that. And it concludes by saying that the scholar plans to next translate the more than 200-page manuscript and compile a lexicon for future scholars to pore over and study its linguistic import, as well as study its contents for what they reveal about that period in time. However, this original article is from 2019, it's 5 years, and if you Google it, you don't really find any follow-ups on it. The only follow-ups that you do find are the ones like this. University backtracks on disputed Voynich Manuscript theory. Bristol distances itself from the academic who claims to have solved the century-old mystery. Bristol University says that Dr. Gerhard Cheshire had succeeded where countless cryptographers, linguists, and scholars and computer programs have failed by identifying the language and purpose of the mysterious, apparently coded 15th century text. Although the meaning of the volume, held by Yale University, had eluded experts for more than a century, the university said Cheshire had solved the puzzle in just 2 weeks. But now the university has deleted its article about the research, saying concerns had been raised about the validity of this research from academics in the field of linguistics and medieval studies. Having previously described Cheshire as a University of Bristol academic, the university is taking pains to distance itself from him. Oh no. It says the research was entirely the author's own work and is not affiliated with the University of Bristol, the School of Arts, nor the Center of Medieval Studies. We have nothing to do with any of this. We're taking it all back. It was genius. We thought it was. Now it's not anymore. Cheshire told The Guardian that he felt no disappointment at all. This is fine. This is totally fine. It was inevitable and expected given the passion that the manuscript arouses. That a marginal group would find it difficult to accept that we have new evidence, right? So again, it's not really holding up, it feels like, his findings. And also, again, like, this is more than 5 years old, this article. The whole story is there's no follow-up. He never came forward, like this Cheshire guy never came forward and said, well, I've now decrypted 100 pages of the manuscript using this method. It really stuck with those few claims that he made at the time. And as you can see, the University of Bristol has backtracked. So I don't know how much validity this really holds. It doesn't seem like a lot. Now, I do have my own theories of what we might be looking at here when talking about the Voynich Manuscript. And again, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a linguist or codebreaker or cryptologist or whatever. I have no idea. I'm just speculating. I'm looking at what I see here, and I've come up, kind of concluded, 2 main theories, and they might interlink slightly what we might be looking at here. And again, this is just my opinion. This is my interpretation. I'm curious to hear your interpretation. What do you think it is? Do you think it links to anything paranormal, any aliens? Don't hesitate to share your thoughts down in the comment section below. I'm very curious to hear it, actually. But my first theory of what this might be is basically an art project. Okay, made up plans, a made up script, and it could basically be an elaborate doodle book made by an artist or a writer who basically used it as an experimental project, some kind of world building exercise, right? We get this all the time now more than ever, obviously, with movies and so on, where we have like very deep movie lore, whether it's the Lord of the Rings or Star Trek, where we have fictitious languages that kind of go along with the whole lore of the universe. But it could really have just been a person who was very smart at the time who came up with this idea to create a mystery. Right, like something that people would bite their teeth on, that they would try to decipher over centuries to come, but you can't really decipher it ever, no matter how far in the future you go, because it's undecipherable, because it simply makes no sense. And there are other examples like this. For example, there is a book called the Codex Seraphinianus. And yes, it does contain the word anus. All right, let's just get it all out of our system. It's funny, very, very funny. But this is a book that was published in the early 80s, written in the late 70s, and it's very similar to the Voynich Manuscript in the sense that it uses a language that has no meaning. And it shows illustrations that are just abstract. Now, obviously, again, it's been written in the late 70s, so it takes more modern cues than the Voynich Manuscript, right? Like, it almost takes cues from comic books here or something like that. But it was put together by Italian artist, architect, and industrial designer Luigi Serafini. It roughly has 360 pages, and it's described as an illustrated encyclopedia of an imaginary world, right? Like, that puts it quite nicely. It is a visual exploration of a fantasy world. And same like the Voynich Manuscript, it also explores plants and fictitious plants and writing here as well. The architect himself said that the writing and the language in the book, the scripture, has no meaning at all. It makes no sense. So it is really just obscure imagery with text that holds no meaning. And there are other examples of this as well. This is just one of them. People have been doing this for a long time. Now, what I really love, if this would be the case, let's assume for a second that's what it is, that in the early 1400s, a very smart guy sits down and writes this fictitious book that is basically an encyclopedia of an imaginary world. And he just tries to give people a puzzle that they can never solve because there is no solution to it. It is actually a stroke of genius in my mind, if that would be the case, that he uses it the way he did, right? Looking at the manuscript itself and how it's written, right? It almost feels like a diary of someone traveling around, collecting information and documenting things around him that we could never understand, right? It's almost like an early version of a found footage film. You know what I mean? He came up with this idea to write something that feels so real, that feels like maybe something a scientist would put together in order to document this foreign country that he traveled to, someone like Charles Darwin or something, but it makes no sense and it will puzzle humanity for the rest of its existence. It's actually genius, the way he put it together and how he made it feel like this diary of illustrations. However, looking at the illustrations in a bit more depth, what I found is they are not really scientific illustrations of plants. If you look at scientific illustrations of plants, they're very much about capturing details, capturing unique properties of those plants. That's not what you see here. These illustrations are rough. These illustrations are not very detailed. It almost lacks too much detail for us to understand what these plants really would be, right? They really look like they've been like cobbled together quite quickly, rather than someone actually trying to capture something in a scientific method. This looks like someone was trying to emulate something that looks scientific, right? Like someone trying to replicate the book or a notebook that a scientist may have, in which he takes his notes and does these illustrations without really understanding what a scientist would do. And to me, that fact kind of plays into this theory, right? It doesn't look like someone who was genuinely trying to convey the authenticity of like all these plants and trying to capture that forever. It seems more like a blender, right? Something that has a lot of content and there's a lot to go through and to analyze. But in fact, if you look at the single units, the single pieces, there's not a lot there. But again, it's not just plant life, right? If you look at the later pages, I mentioned it earlier briefly, like it seems to be going into like constellations or like star signs, and again, like quite complex diagrams. Very, very difficult to make sense of this. There's also loads of depictions of women in bathtubs in some green goo. There's nudity going on, okay? Like some people have suggested that this might actually have served as some kind of, let's just say, adult content of the time, because there's loads of nudity and there are details, right? It's loads of naked women. There are boobies. There are boobies in this book. And keep in mind, I mean, people in the 1400s, dude, people were desperate, okay? We didn't have access to adult content like we have today. So this might be just, I don't know, adult entertainment of the time. But again, like these reoccurring images, like the ones you see here. At times, it almost seems like the guy who put it together wanted to convey a very specific image, right? Like it seems like, I don't know, like some kind of ritual, something that he had a desire about communicating and telling people about. But again, it's just an interpretation. I don't know if are these the children we spoke about earlier? These are not children, right? That doesn't make much sense. I couldn't find the illustration of the women bathing the children in this book. But anyway, so this is my first theory, right? The idea that it's basically an elaborate art piece of a quite smart person that was way ahead of its time, creating this world-building exercise, trying to create something that will puzzle humanity for the rest of its existence. It's obscure imagery with text that holds no meaning, and whoever put it together wanted to create like something that will last for a very long time through the power of mythicism, so to say. I do have a second theory though as well, and that one almost bleeds into the first a little bit. So I think this could also be the work of someone, let's say a person who has neurological challenges or maybe some kind of mental illness. Now, keep in mind, early 1400s, we didn't know what schizophrenia was. We didn't know what, delusional paranoia, but all these conditions presumably existed at the time. Now, let's assume for a second you would be a schizophrenic person and you would almost have like this mania where you keep writing and you can't stop. You put this thing together and it almost keeps you in check, right? It's almost like a therapeutic piece. You keep putting it together. It is all fantastical. It's all originating in your head. It has no meaning and purpose, but the purpose of it is to give your life some kind of meaning, and you just keep going through it and working towards this goal of completing this. Now, obviously, at that time, we didn't have any mental health care facilities. That was not a thing, because as someone pointed out quite rightly when I was discussing this in a live stream the other day, if you're rich, you're not seen as crazy. You're seen as eccentric, right? Like people will respect if you do something like this and you're basically mentally ill if you just have enough money. And beyond that, I mean, a lot of these illustrations, let's be honest, as I said earlier, they don't feel scientific. They feel somewhat manic. Do you know what I mean? They feel scribbled and cobbled together, and it seems like someone who's like has a lot going on in their head and they want to put all these things down and capture all this very important knowledge, when actually it is just a delusion. It's just a person who has a delusion, who has also like some artistic skills and the ability to come up with scripture. And here they are creating like this huge piece, but it is basically the valve that someone was using who was suffering from mental illness at the time. And I read an article actually where like a psychologist who was working in a psychiatric ward compared the Voynich manuscript to the writing of a neurological patient that they had at the time. Now, obviously, this is confidential, so I can't show it to you. I haven't seen it myself, but that psychologist said that there were absolutely similarities between the writings of this woman that was struggling with her cognitive functioning and the Voynich manuscript. The idea that someone goes through this huge effort and almost makes it a lifelong obsession to create something like this is not unthinkable, especially when it comes to mental illnesses and these kind of manic conditions. If you look at the last few pages, it's actually amazing because someone pointed this out as we were talking about it on live stream. Someone was like, so how does it end, right? So the ending is here, but then check this out. The last few pages of this book is just scripture. It's like 10, 15, 20 pages, scripture after scripture. And someone also said, could it just be writing practice? Could it be someone who just doesn't know how to write, doing it anyway? With that, I kind of disagree. I don't think that's what it is because it looks too elaborate. It seems to be following some kind of pattern, as any language does, right? It follows certain letters that you align to form words, but it's just looking especially at these last 10, 20 pages. It is so hard to imagine that someone would write like 20, 30 pages like this without having any idea what they are writing. Even if it is an art project, even if it is a person that was suffering from mental challenges, would you do that? I don't know. It is tricky. Again, I can't decipher it for you guys, unfortunately, but this is kind of where I got to on the Voynich manuscript. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Personally, I think it just doesn't make sense. I think it is designed to not be deciphered. It is designed by someone who loves a good mystery and who wanted us to look at that for the rest of infinity and try to make sense of it. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen. Even in 100, 200 years from now, people will still look at this book and be kind of drawn in by its mythicism and its lack of being explained. So it's a fascinating story, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Maybe I missed something. Maybe there are some certain insights. I couldn't cover the whole story. The Wikipedia page is very, very long. There's a lot of information there that I couldn't cover in this video. But if you have other important thoughts, maybe your own theory of what it might be, I would really appreciate to read them down in the comments. There's a lot that we can discuss here. So maybe let's start a little bit of a discussion down in the comments, and maybe we can decipher it in the comment section under this video. Probably not, but we can try. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. That's it, guys. Thank you so much for checking out the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to smash the like button. Maybe subscribe to the channel for more. I would greatly appreciate that. Also, we've just launched a gaming channel. If you're into video games, join Monkey Games. The link is in the description. Our Discord is a great community as well. You can join that, meet new people, make new friends, meet like-minded people who enjoy stuff like this, amongst other mysterious and paranormal and unexplainable stories. It's all going on over there on our Discord. The link to that is in the description as well. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. I'm out. Bye.